Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Spoiler Warning podcast. This is a special bonus episode where we are currently in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and we are about to talk about the first 8 films that we saw at TIFF this year. Steven, how's it feeling? It's officially day 5 of the festival, day 4 for us, I think, or I might have been off by one.
Yeah, it's technically day 4, but we arrived like in the evening on day 1, so this is really like day 3.5, I feel like, for us.
Okay, so
we've had 2 full days of the festival plus like a little bonus evening screening.
One extra night. Yeah. So we're trying to get this recorded before we head out to our next 3 films. Yeah, and anything you would like to say to listeners before we get started?
Just that it's always fun to be back in Toronto. I think in terms of festivals, this is probably one of the least hectic ones. You know, you can book seats in advance. Every single screening this year is reserved seating too, so you don't even have the kind of like frenzied, am I going to be able to get something where I can actually see the screen, you know?
Yeah.
So it's nice. I'm having fun. I always like, being back in the festival circuit.
Yeah, when we realized that was the plan for this year, it was like, oh my God, that makes things so much better.
Yeah.
Like we are close enough to the action here that we can easily get to things, but being able to go, hey, we can actually eat now.
Yes, I know. We have eaten every meal this year so far we've been able to have, which is not usually a given on a trip like this.
It's a lot of, snacking on something from the convenience store across the street from the theater you're about to go stand in line for.
Yeah, but now we're being healthy. We're eating exclusively bar food.
Hey, we had some nice healthy wraps one day.
That's true.
All right. Well, what do you say we get into it, Stephen?
Let's do it.
All right. So as we said, 8 films. We're just going to talk a little bit about each of them and, let you know our thoughts. And, if I was smarter, I probably would have been writing down release dates as I was making my notes for this, but we're just going to do this. Yeah. Who wants to get started?
I guess I can start with We Live in Time. So this is a movie folks might already be familiar with. I know I've seen a bunch of trailers already. It's a A24 film that is coming out relatively soon. This is directed by John Crowley, who did Brooklyn and The Goldfinch. And it is basically a non-linear love story between 2 people starring Andrew Garfield and Florence Pugh. The trailers didn't give a lot away, so I won't give a ton away either, except for this is clearly people are falling in love, major life events happen, and I think it's pretty clear that there's going to be a cancer subplot just from the trailer. So it's a kind of weepy romance film. I don't know, are we doing the thing where we describe it and then lob it to the other person first, or we launch into our own feelings and then lob it?
You can launch into your feelings after you describe it, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So yeah, this is a movie that I was looking forward to, but the trailer kind of scared me a little bit because it felt a little like Zach Braff coded to me. Like this is going to be just maybe very melodramatic, and I'm here for a weepy melodrama. Like About Time, I've probably seen like 7 times. Like I have a soft spot for this kind of thing. Like the cereal company that Andrew Garfield's character works for in this movie, this feels like the Oops All Berries of British weepy romances.
I thought you were going to say it feels a little regular.
No, this is like the Oops All Climaxes to me of weepy romances. It is a movie that it basically chops and screws a rom-com, so it is just jumping between the most extreme points in people's lives. You know, how did they meet? What is a big fight that they had? What are major moments of like potentially trying to start a family, potentially trying to get closer, major diagnoses you can have. And there's something about that felt like a cheat code to me that made a lot of the movie it didn't feel like it amounted to very much because it felt like it was just trying to hit the high notes in like a mixtape of what a rom-com would normally have. Here's the thing though, Andrew Garfield and Florence Pugh are really, really good in this movie. Like they are great. Garfield is always good at playing the earnest, lovable guy. This is kind of like if you took his like Tick Tick Boom character and gave him some like sedatives, so he was still as like optimistic and sweet about the world, but he kind of like slowed down a little bit. And Florence Pugh, you and I were talking after the screening, like I think this is easily the best meaty role I've seen her take before. And there are scenes that are really wonderful. Like my favorite one in the movie actually takes place very early in a parking garage, and it's just the 2 of them having a kind of a difficult conversation where they're kind of like obliquely referencing a thing and dancing around it, and there's just so much emotion there. I'm not totally dead inside. Like, the movie did warm my heart. There are things that I loved about it, but I don't know. It felt like empty calories to me. Just the way that it is made felt like the number of times they mashed the button of cry, 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 kind of numbed me to it. So I like the performances a lot, but I had a lot of trouble seeing, quote, truth in this movie, which is a word everyone in the Q&A kept throwing out.
Yeah.
To me, this didn't quite clear the bar that I was hoping it would. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I liked it a little bit more than you, but I had all the same problems you did. So for me, you know, I was prepared for a cry, 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 cry movie, like push the button, make you cry thing. And like I was more prepared to be fully devastated by this film. And instead what I got was kind of a loving, hopeful sort of kind of like, yeah, things are mostly okay, even though there's other bad stuff happening around it. It's like people that understand what they're going through and are having the moments that you need to see because you're watching a movie about an entire relationship. But at the same time, it's not really commenting on it. You're just seeing the moments happen. And I know that like we've seen lots of other films where you can just check in on a group of people, see their moment, and go like, oh my God, that movie was beautiful and says so much. And this film felt more like it was sitting in these moments without a lot to say about them. And that to me kind of like brought it down like a little notch, you know, like I think when we were both walking out, we were kind of like, yeah, it was like, you did it. You showed a relationship, but I was missing the real conversations. There was a single conversation, which I won't spoil in this film, which is like the moment that other films would be all about those, where it's them actually talking about what certain decisions mean to the other person. And it's like two people saying, you are being selfish with wildly different contexts. And I'm like, okay, you're finally starting to say something about what it means for two people to be in a relationship and like work on something together. And I was like, why is this film not that conversation the entire time? And instead, it's really just two people who have a very, very cute relationship existing in their cute relationshipness. And even though tragedy and bad things are happening around, you just getting to see their sort of, because they're both sort of quirky characters, right? Like in a film that was more one-sided, maybe you would see like one quirky character and then a normal character, and they're both sort of quirky and they both have their things. But there's a lot of heightened stuff about it too. Like, you know, like all of the backstories we learn about Florence Pugh, I'm like, really? She's all of those things? You know? It's like, and it became a little too much, but on the whole, I enjoyed it. I thought it was very warm feeling. And it was kind of like one of those things where like, it was our first film of the festival. And I was like, man, this is a perfect first film of the festival, right? It's just like, you know, the pool's a little bit chilly. Let me dip in slowly until my body acclimates to it. And I felt like it was a good introduction to, you know, we had just landed, checked in, got ready, went out to see our first film. And I was like, yeah, I'm happy about that. Like, that was nice. I liked it. So, you know, again, happy with it. But it didn't really blow me away. And I was prepared to be like, oh man, I hope I packed some Kleenexes. And instead I was kind of like, yeah, there was a few moments where I got a little misty, but it didn't hit me on that level because I was mostly just like, oh, okay, yeah, I like this, you know. So
yeah, I mean, for me, even like the cute relationship stuff felt more authentic to me. Like I believed it, but that was still, it was like just mashing a different button over and over again. This was mashing the cute, quirky indie relationship drama button. And there was just something about it that it was like missing the connective tissue that would make me be more invested in the characters. And it was almost frustrating that it still works because it was like, you're just showing me like a music video of people falling in love, you know?
And to be fair, like when everybody's talking about the authenticity, I felt that too, but it wasn't the authenticity of the relationship. It was the authenticity of their chemistry. Like these two people, I believe, would have experienced all these things together, but it wasn't that like, I was like, oh shit, that's a really good depiction of a relationship. It was just a really good depiction of those two people's feelings towards each other. And yeah, so that's sort of where we are with that one. All right. So moving on to the next one is we have a little film called The Life of Chuck. Unless I'm getting into that order. But this is a film that's coming to us from Mike Flanagan, and it's based on a novella by Stephen King. And basically, it is sort of told in these three sort of acts, like normal film is. But in this case, these 3 acts are sort of a presentation of a degrading world, a presentation of Chuck at a certain moment in time, and then a presentation of the things in Chuck's life that built to the moment that he was able to experience in that second act. And this is a film that, I kind of was just going into slightly optimistically, being a fan of some of the things that I've watched that, came from Mike Flanagan. And I think that for me, I was genuinely super surprised by how much I enjoyed this film. I love all 3 acts wholly in different ways, and I love the way they interplay together. And as it sort of starts to tip its hat to exactly what's happening, which it just does kind of early. It's not like it's a sudden reveal later on. But I really like the way it sort of plays with what's going on. I love the dialogue around people, in a world kind of like our pandemic world, where society was just breaking down, or maybe the current modern political landscape that we live in, where society is just breaking down, or just, general things where society breaks down. I kind of like the dialogue and the resigned nature of how people are just responding to it. And it's not like a movie where shit's happening and everybody's panicking and the world's going to hell. It's kind of just like everybody is just resigned to, like, I guess this is the end. And what the fuck is this weird thing that's also happening, right? Yeah. And the way the film plays with that and ties it through all 3 acts, I thought was kind of brilliant. There are some, I'll call it fantasy elements in the story, which I loved. Like, you know where they're going, but it still hits with a weight that feels really, really great. And yeah, like the performances in the film are amazing. It's like the casting too of all the people in the world that is breaking down in the first act feels so great. Like the people they bring in to deliver lines, it all hit for me perfectly. And I kept sitting through that film going like, holy shit, I really, really like this movie. So what did you think of it, Steven?
Yeah, I think you liked it a little more than me, but I also liked this movie quite a bit. I think all 3 of those acts are well done in different ways. I think my favorite was probably the first act, which is the last act. I could be going in either direction, but the apocalyptic act to me was the one that I probably liked the most, just because I think it brings you into this entire universe in a good way, and it's a smart, clever way to have characters talk about existential crises and wax poetic about philosophy in a way that feels authentic, because that is exactly what all of us were doing and would have done in a moment like this. And I really like the light, fantastical elements that happen there. I like the conversations, just the tone of the movie. I felt like, oh, I'm in good hands. Like, I'm in the hands of someone who knows how to carry me through a story. Chiwetel Ejiofor and Karen Gillan, I think, are both really, really lovely in those parts. I won't spoil Act 2 much, except to say it is just like pure joy. There's it's one of those things that it doesn't even matter what it means. Like, there's just so much joy in experiencing that.
And it is real fast. It is kind of funny too, because like during like the Q&As and stuff, everybody kept saying joy too, as though it was like a company line they were supposed to say, like, make sure whatever you say joy 50 times. But then you watch the film and you're like, oh no, that's just the only way you can describe this. Like,
joy is 100% the way to describe it. And then, the younger story, Act 1, which is the third act that we see in the movie. I liked it, right? It reminded me a lot of Stand By Me, which I don't know if you've seen before, but similar. The only issue that I take, and this is actually a recurring theme of this festival, is there's a lot of telling rather than showing in this movie, exemplified by very, very, very heavy reliance on Nick Offerman narrating the film in what I imagine, and I think in the Q&A, Mike Flanagan confirmed this, are just like cut and pasted whole cloth from Stephen King's novella. There are moments when that narration works beautifully. Act 2, I think, is wonderful for the narration. Like I think that is exactly the way you want that story to be told. When we are really seeing Chuck's youth and we're learning about what he is learning and what he's experiencing, I feel like the acting is well done enough that you didn't need to tell us so much. You didn't need to pause the action over and over again to tell us this is what he's thinking, this is what he's feeling. And there was just a bit that felt hindered to me by that. Like, I felt like the movie kept kind of getting in its own way there, when letting it just be an expression of like joy and then quiet kind of melancholy, which is what the movie wants to strike. I think we could have sat in that a lot more if we didn't keep having like Nick Offerman show up and like tell us like, and this is where you're supposed to feel melancholy. I'm like, yeah, I know. I know already, dude.
So I will say though, I feel like it strikes a tone that for me 100% works. I think you needed more, not less. Because for me, what happens is it's going, you're like, okay, this is the tone we're going with. This is what's happening. But then when it disappears for a second, you almost forget it's there. And then when it comes back, it's disorienting again because you went normal movie, narration movie. And then I think if it was constant narration, you know, not too much, but I mean, if there weren't, it's kind of like a movie that makes you cry and laugh.
Yeah.
And then it's like, you need enough of the back and forth to like settle to something. But if it's like, oh, we're just in this happy, fun movie and all of a sudden, it's too jarring, right?
Yeah, I just think like it's not fair for me to compare to Stand By Me, which is like one of the best movies of the 80s, you know, but like that movie knew how to just sit in the emotion for a while without holding your hand more. Like it trusted its actors to basically communicate everything. And this movie, there's just like a little bit too much telling to me, but still I like this one quite a bit. I was totally happy with this movie, and it came out of nowhere because I was not really expecting anything from it.
It's like it's not that I was expecting anything from it, but I was like optimistically like, oh, this could be pretty cool, and I was still shocked by how much I was like vibing with it, and there is some really heavy existential things that are kind of just like thrown out there in the middle of it that I'm like, oh my God, I love so much what this is doing right now. Yeah. Like a little germ that's planted in the first act that is the third act, like that feeds all the way back to the third act, which is the first act.
Yeah. No, it's good.
It's like, you're like, oh shit. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. There's a lot of cleverness in how they constructed this movie. And I think it worked well. Just for me, don't use as much narration, but personal preference. The next film is called All of You. This was directed by William Bridges, who co-wrote it with Brett Goldstein, and it stars Brett Goldstein and Imogen Poots as basically two... This is another one where I don't remember what all they gave away, but I'll say it's two friends who are living in a world where you can take a test to figure out who the one is. And I don't think it's going to be too spoilery, because anyone who knows that this is a movie will probably know that there's going to be some chemistry or something between those friends that is at odds with the fact that they can take this test.
Everyone who grew up a boy
exactly
is going to know exactly what's going on in this film.
Yeah. So I have two movies that we've seen over the last few days that I think give the audience exactly what it promises them, and this is one of those movies. Which isn't to say this is perfect. Like, it's a small contemplative movie, and it basically lives or dies on the chemistry of Brett Goldstein and Imogen Poots. I'm thinking about like a lot of those little indie movies in the 2000s I would have watched, like Breaking Upwards, or like things that are just like, let's talk about a relationship. And that's all this will be. And luckily, I think the cast are just really up for the task in this one. Like, I totally believe the friendship, semi-relationship-y dynamic that these two people have. You and I saw Fingernails at TIFF last year, and Fingernails was a light sci-fi about a world where you could see if you were soulmates with someone or see if you were truly in love with each other. And that movie was asking a question of, what if you love someone and they love you, but you still don't know how to love each other in quite the way you want to be loved? And is that enough? Like is really loving someone enough if there are still more shades of that love you would prefer? Yeah. And this movie is almost doing it the other way around, where it's saying, what if you knew who the one was, and yet you still have this feeling for this other person? You know it's not supposed to work out. You know it isn't right, quote, but you still have it. What do you do with that mood? And I thought that was just like a lovely, interesting sentiment. I don't want to spoil where this movie goes, but it does things that usually I think alienate both of us when it comes to following or rooting for characters or feeling certain emotions. And I don't know what it is about this movie, but I was there for both characters the whole time. Like I felt like I could empathize with them, and I thought this was just doing a lovely, somewhat like understated thing, where this is one of those movies that didn't do too much of the telling versus showing. Like, there's one big monologue where it does the telling toward the end, and it's been building to that like the whole time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just thought it was it is the exact kind of movie that I go to festivals to watch, which is quiet, pretty stripped down, relationship driven, two actors just doing a very solid job of what they're good at. So yeah, I was pretty taken by this one. How about you?
Yeah, I think I feel similarly to this one that I do to We Live in Time, where it's like, yeah, these characters have amazing chemistry. I'm down for whatever's happening here. And I think that this one, because it's going high concept, sort of, it starts high concept and then immediately throws that away and just kind of goes for the story. Because, you know, when everybody came out and was talking before the film, they were like, this is a long conversation we've been having about what would happen after this premise. And like, it is a good dissection of that. But it's like, it needs to have the premise at the beginning to get to the conversation it wants to tell, but it's not actually interested in the premise. It's just interested in the conversation. But then at the same time, I don't know that it has a lot to say about the conversation is what would happen, not how do you feel about what would happen. And I think that for me, the film is a little bit lacking the how would you feel about what would happen. And I also feel in a weird way that it's too lopsided to what would be my point of view. You know what I mean? Like it is preaching to the choir in a way where it just feels a little too not nuanced, right? Like, we know what the setup is. We know the truth going into the setup. We know what's going to happen. I jokingly, I'm not going to say what I jokingly told you before because I guess I don't want to spoil it. But I feel like we know what the narrative is, and the only real kind of flipping on the head of that narrative is that middle section of what the characters decide to do about it. And that's where I think I could hear the film audibly lose some people in the theater during those scenes. And I think for me, just in general, it was kind of like, yeah, I like these characters. I don't know that I like the history of these characters. And it's kind of like, I get the premise. I believe these things could potentially happen, but it stretches the things that could happen for a long time. And, you know, maybe that's the benefit of not having to worry about cancer in the story.
Right.
Like, the other film had a theoretical time frame that we could have a window into this relationship. And this is just like, for all time, this is the pattern of what these characters will go through. And I think that I wanted more of a nuanced discussion. You know, you said there was that one moment where they've been building through it the whole film, so you know it has to be there. Again, I wanted that the whole time. And maybe it just goes back to my usual thing of you know, characters should just say the thing. Like, a character could have said the thing
Right.
day one in this story, and it may or may not have affected anything. But yeah, it's an interesting premise, and the film is more about what happens after the premise happens. And you know, characters make decisions that I would not necessarily make myself. But I still love seeing these two characters exist together and just kind of be best friends. And I just wanted more actual discussion about what they were going through instead of just in occasional moments when one of them is upset.
Yeah, interesting. It's funny because you mentioned how you could hear the film lose people and then it lives in that space for a while. I think that's what bumped this up a bit for me, is because I don't think I've seen many movies that are willing to do that for so long. Just
have the complexity exist as a...
Have that complexity exist, and I think it exists in a way where it has a lot to do with, you know, both of the leads, but especially Brett Goldstein is like sells this kind of like rugged, like not, you know, like you root for him even when it doesn't feel like you should be rooting for him. And I think like this movie needed someone like that to sell that. And the fact that I felt weird about it is what I liked, because otherwise this would have been a like just like straight over the home plate, like, here you go, this is the friend zone movie. And I think it does something that feels more daring to me, and the fact that it still felt sweet even while it also is a little like sour is kind of what pulled me in more.
Yeah, I guess for me it's like a self-awareness of like, it's making me root for him, but I feel like I'm only rooting for him because, like, you know, 19-year-old me would have been like, oh my god, this movie gets me, right?
Yeah.
But like adult me is like, no, I shouldn't be rooting for him. What the fuck's going on?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just like a weird internal struggle in my head that is like makes me feel weird about what this film is doing.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on. Next, we have a film that I'm going to tee up and then lob over to Steven. So the next film is a little film called The Room Next Door. It's the latest film from Pedro Almodovar, and it stars Tilda Swinton and Julianne Moore. And the night we sat down to watch this, it was announced that this film won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival. So obviously this is a film that is getting a lot of praise, a filmmaker that's getting a lot of praise. I think I've only seen Parallel Mothers of his other films. I haven't seen anything else in his work. But this is a film that's, I think it's safe to say that like we added to the list because it was something you were definitely curious about. And I was like, oh, I recognize the name. Steven's going to want to see this. So I put it on my short list as well. I was a little bit optimistic knowing that it was getting so much praise going into it. I did not care for this movie though. This film has a very strange tone. And I think it's you know, we were having a little talk as we walked back from the theater that I think that films that touch on certain subjects or approach certain subjects about society and like sort of try to make little political statements here and there, I think get a lot of praise just for the sheer sake of them doing it. But unlike the conversations that are happening in The Life of Chuck, where it's all existential and talking about the idea of what it means to feel like to be in a state, this film is mostly, here's our subject matter. Let's have conversations about how absurd it is that we're even having this conversation. And for me, that doesn't work at all. And it feels that this film is trying to be really, really quirky while discussing a serious topic. And we have past years at the festival seen films that I fucking love that dealt with the same subject matter. And this film just feels like it's playing in the space, but not really commenting on it. And I kept waiting for the film to pull me back in, and I never got pulled in. So, Steven, what did you think of The Room Next Door?
Yeah, I mean, I was very hopeful about this movie, and it baffled me, to be honest. I mean, like, we're kind of dancing around the premise, which I think is good. Some reviews spoil a lot, but there's no reason for us to do that. But the premise has been done before many times, and it has been done better many times. To me, more than anything else that we've seen this year, this embodies the telling rather than showing problem that I'm feeling a lot at this festival. One bit of chatter out of Venice, because before this won the Golden Lion, it wasn't getting like universal acclaim. Like it was already somewhat divisive among critics.
Yeah.
And the chatter was that the dialogue in English felt stilted. It was like Almodovar maybe should have worked with an American scriptwriter to make sure that like it felt like he did Google Translate and just like plopped it in exactly in the kind of like high romantic language that you might use in Spanish, rather than being like, how would two Americans in New York have this conversation?
Yeah.
But I don't know if any generous reading of the dialogue where I can like paraphrase it or something would change the fact that this is still a movie of people blurting out things like, I'm personally very afraid of death. Oh, I'm actually not, because I'm a war journalist, and as a war journalist, we often are exposed to things that make us more numb. Like, characters are just saying the philosophical thing over and over again in a way that just feels very clunky and awkward to me, and it doesn't give them any, like, interiority or depth of character. Like, Julianne Moore and Tilda Swinton are two wonderful actors. Like, they're great. I do not see the evidence of that in this movie. Like, I just see people who are reciting dialogue that they like, there is no way to make it possibly seem like the authentic overflowing of a human being, you know? And yeah, the movie is like you said, it's commenting on subject. It's like, here's the premise. Premise sounds great, you know, makes a lot of sense. Here are the characters and their backstories. Cool. I can see how that would feed into the premise in an interesting way. And then the movie just like says that instead of like following the thread and letting you like feel any kind of push and pull of emotion associated with it. There are moments of, I would say, like intentionally like dark, campy humor around the subject matter that sometimes got me. Like I had a few good laughs, mostly about like the way Tilda Swinton says things throughout the movie in like kind of jarring, awkward ways. But for the most part, like, yeah, there was nothing for me to lose myself in as a film at all. Like, it had hints of his style, which I've seen a good number of Almodovar's films, and he's known for his use of color, he's known for his kind of visual arrangement of things, and this definitely had some of that. But I felt like I was watching the outline of a stage play that like no one did a second pass at to make sure it actually hit any kind of like emotionally resonant beat. And I mentioned this to you, and I didn't know if I wanted to say it on the pod, but fuck it, why not? I think for a movie that is anchored by two of like the greatest, living actresses, it is strange to me that the only naturalistic character is like John Turturro swooping in for a couple scenes. I don't know if like he was able to just revise his dialogue because no one cared, or he just happened to get like the more naturalistic things to say. But when he would show up, I'd be like, oh, human beings do exist. Like, this isn't like a Yorgos Lanthimos movie. But yeah, I don't know. It's a really bewildering one, and I'm kind of shocked at how much praise this thing is getting.
Yeah, I said something else while we were chatting on the walk back, and I just figured out a better way to put it. So one of the things, this is a festival, we're around a lot of other people. We're not usually around this many other people. But when we're standing in line, sitting in a theater waiting for a movie to happen, there are people who are performatively having a conversation.
Right.
They are talking theoretically to each other, but talking to the audience around them. Just delivering lines to the universe so that you hear the fact that they're having a conversation. The characters in this film are doing that too. They're talking past each other. They're talking at us, the audience, and they're just saying their own thing as though they're not in a conversation. They're just talking to us. And that not only bugs me in the real world, but bugs me in the context of the film too. So yeah, it's did not work for me.
I hear you. And if you want to see a movie that I think does a lot of these things, not the core premise, but a lot of it better, watch The Eternal Daughter, which also includes Tilda Swinton playing her own mother. So there's so many better versions of this story. It honestly, I don't want to like impugn the motives of juries or whatever, because it's totally possible this just worked for a lot of people. Yeah. But for me, like if this was meant to be like a Lifetime Achievement Award, like Pain and Glory, like the movie he did a few years ago, was so fucking good. And like it isn't like this is a guy who has lost step with the culture or anything. Like I don't get why this is the movie that he's getting lavished with praise for.
No.
All right. The next movie is a little film called Eden, directed by Ron Howard. I didn't really know anything about this going into it, but it tells the story of there were a family, a doctor and his wife from Germany who moved to an island that was uninhabited as a part of the Galapagos to try to create this society for themselves, where it's like we are living apart from nature, we're rederiving what it means to be a person, and eventually others follow. So this film really follows a family, Sydney Sweeney and Daniel Bruhl, as they join them on the island and want to build their own life. And then it shows the kind of push and pull of neighbors as people start to appear on the island, and basically a society is forming, and you're having all the problems with society recreated in this very tiny, incubator of just a few people. I think walking into this film, you said something like, "Oh, this is like a real movie." Like and that's exactly how I felt watching it. Is like, wow, this is like a real movie. Like, it looks like $1 million. It feels like a thing that could go wide in theaters and be widely beloved by people. And in general, I liked it just fine. I told you that this was like my naiad so far this year, which is like, it's telling a true story. It's telling it well. I don't think it's doing anything amazing or wonderful, but it is like totally satisfying to me in what it wants to be. It has a lot of very, I don't know if I'll go as far as to say campy. It has actors who are having a lot of fun with their characters. Yeah. Like Jude Law and Vanessa Kirby are having a blast as these kind of like fiendish, almost like German villain type people.
Yeah. There's camp. There's camp for sure.
I'll give them camp for sure in those roles. Sydney Sweeney and Daniel Bruhl are more of the kind of like straight men in the story, and I think they pull that off just fine. Ana de Armas comes along and does what she does very well in this movie.
She's the MVP in this movie.
She's definitely
for sure.
the MVP. Though I don't know. I also think Jude Law is like really, really fun to watch in this movie too.
Yeah, 100%. But it's like you can only have one MVP.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure. They're duking it out figuratively and literally. For that role. I think this is a kind of surprising turn from Ron Howard, like the guy who most recently gave us Hillbilly Elegy, because this is a movie that is not very sentimental. Like, this is basically alternate alternating between camp and tension. You know, it has a lot of dark humor, and then it also has a lot of like real kind of dramatic stakes and thrills. And I think everyone is just doing really, really good work here. And it's just a satisfying story that it doesn't go as deep as maybe I would have wanted to, but it is, it's a pleasing story, and I was glad that I saw it. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting story, and this is a film that was born out of a real-life story that has competing narratives, right? Like, two people who lived through it wrote their own accounts of what happened. Nobody knows the real truth, so this is a film that is, you know, drawing a line in the sand and saying these are what the events are that happened at this time. But yeah, it's a film that, like, if you explain the premise, you're like, yeah, that totally makes sense why this is interesting and why somebody would want to make a film at it. And it's a film that really, it rests on the presentation of how hard it is to live in a place without society,
right.
and the complexities that come from trying to add society to a thing, right? It's also kind of funny that the film's like thesis is like the real problem with utopia is society.
Yeah.
You're like, the only way to have utopia is have no people.
Exactly. Yeah, it's basically like as soon as you introduce people into the mix, no matter what the scale is, all of the problems that exist in the big world are still going to exist.
Yeah. It's like two people go to an uninhabited place to write a manifesto about how to create a perfect society, and immediately shit goes bad when you just add two more people.
It's almost Stanford Prison Experiment on the Galapagos.
So I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the performances. I kind of, like, in a weird way, I want to go more into Jude Law's manifesto. And like, I kind of wish the film wanted to dive into that stuff more. Cause like the most interesting thing to me is like how somebody can be so steadfast in what they believe and churn out this thing about like, I can fix everything. And then just one parameter is changed, and then fucking their whole world falls apart.
Right.
So like that stuff was super interesting to me. I was joking with you a little bit as we were having dinner after the film that like in a world where there's only in a world where there's only like less than 10 people, you can't really get away with trying to steal from each other.
Right. Not a smart move.
Because it's not like, oh, what if it was someone else on the island? It's like, no, it's just us. So that was those kind of aspects of the film kind of made me chuckle a little bit. But yeah, all in all, I enjoyed watching this film. And I don't know how long it's going to stick with me. Maybe like in the same context of like Naiad, where I'm like, oh yeah, that was fun. I like that. But it's definitely an interesting premise. I don't know if it's interesting enough for me to go dive into the real truth and try to dig up what happened. Mm-hmm. But, you know, in this context, as I said, no one knows the real story. Like the last living people who lived through it are no longer living in real life. So it's just like a thing where we just have the accounts of whoever wants to try to tell this story. But yeah, super interesting. So, had fun. So the next film on the list is a little film called The Last Showgirl. It's a film from Gia Coppola. Yeah, this is a film that is about a what do you call a showgirl show? It's a show in Vegas.
Right. It's like a cabaret type thing.
Yeah, like a long-running show in Vegas that is having its doors close in the next 2 weeks. And it is an aging showgirl who is sort of dealing with the ramifications of having this show that she has put her last 30 years of life into, and how does she feel about what's happening and the other people around her? How do they feel about it? Maybe how does her family feel about what she does and stuff like that? And this is a film that, you know, was Curious Thing because it stars Pamela Anderson, which seemed like, you know, a very conscious acting choice to choose of who you want to be in your film. And I think that choice that brought the curiosity is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this film for me. I think this film doesn't necessarily know what it wants to say about the experience, and it's sort of relying heavily on who it cast in the story and what this story might mean to them in a way that kind of like left me wanting a little more from it. You know, we talked about these other films that were like, yeah, you did it. This one feels like a little bit like, all right, you did it, right? Like, it's kind of like the performance feels authentic, but I'm bringing a lot of my history and knowledge around who Pamela Anderson is into this story in a way where I feel like the film it's expecting me to bring that, right? And it feels a little bit like a cheat code. You referred to the film as using some cheat codes. Like, for me, it feels a little bit like a cheat code, and that kind of left me wanting more. Like, this doesn't feel like The Wrestler, right? This feels like a much less ambitious film that is expecting me to carry everything into it. And for that, it kind of left me wanting more from it. But I wasn't, it didn't not work completely for me. It's just a thing where I was like, yeah, I kind of just expected a little bit more, but yeah, I don't know. Tell me I'm wrong, Steven.
Yeah, I mean, I was, if I were introducing this movie, I was going to say this is like a contemplative movie that's all about the texture, and usually that doesn't work for you, so I bet it still didn't work for you.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's like at least half true, like it didn't totally work, at least. For me, I mean, I just love this kind of thing. I agree that this is arguably a cheat code, but it's the kind of cheat code that tends to work on me, which is set up a premise, let me just live with characters, have a lot of shots that are just like soaking in the vibe of a place, especially if the emotions they want to express are like some kind of sadness or emptiness or loneliness. Like, that just, it works gangbusters on me a lot. And this movie worked pretty well. Like, I agree, it didn't hit the highs that it could have. It was missing the one big moment that would make me go, holy shit, that is what this movie was made for, But this is almost like if you took a Sean Baker movie and like gave it the same sedatives that Andrew Garfield took for his role, like slow it down, make it gentler, but still have the characters who are kind of like someone else might look at their life and think of them as like a washed up or like a fuck up person, but they care about their life and they are trying to get by. And that doesn't mean they are right in all their decisions. It doesn't mean that they have like a totally clear personal narrative of why they do what they do. It's just saying like, let's empathize and let's feel the kind of brokenness and desperation of that. And for me, that mostly worked. I mean, Pamela Anderson, like, I don't know if the word authentic is what I would use for this performance, because she's communicating something that is almost like a delusion of grandeur, right? Like what you are seen as versus maybe like what your life actually is right now. And I don't want to speak for the actual Pamela Anderson. Like, she might be much more like put together about her history. But whatever she is doing, I found it very moving, to me at least, which is just the heartbreak of like, I am not perceived as young and beautiful the way I used to be. And how do you continue to live and continue to find meaning for yourself in the world? You know, if the real Pamela Anderson hopefully is doing that with her eyes wide open, this character is doing it more by living in the past. Jamie Lee Curtis, man, she just is in this phase of her career. She's just crushing it as like playing women who just don't give a fuck, who are like in some way broken or disillusioned or just are like doing what they have to do to survive. I mean, this, like, take this plus Everywhere All at Once, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and her character in The Bear, and she's just like, she's having a moment. And I think like, if there is a scene in this movie that is this is what the movie's for, sadly, I think like Jamie Lee Curtis is the one who gets it, probably.
So her and Pamela Anderson have a scene that is equivalent. And Jamie Lee Curtis's one is so far and away doing more and more impactful and more emotional than the one that Pamela does, and that is a crime in this film. Like, I mean, great for Jamie Lee Curtis, but it is a thing where it's like noticeable how different those scenes achieve what they're trying to do.
Definitely, yeah. It is. It's kind of unfair when your secondary character is played by someone as great as Jamie Lee Curtis, because it just overshadows the rest. But still, for giving me that moment, this movie immediately like reached a certain star category, because I'm just like, holy shit, that's beautiful. Dave Bautista, I think, is also super great in this movie. He gives a kind of gentle like performance that I haven't seen from him before, that I found pretty moving. So yeah, this isn't a huge one, and this isn't one of those ones that I'm going to be like, wow, #1 of the year, this movie made me cry. But it is the kind of thing that I love going to a festival for, and it when you're a Coppola, especially, this is the kind of movie I want you to make. And this gave me exactly what I was looking for, which is just quiet, gentle, contemplative, and, you know, living with its imperfect characters without really judging them or telling them what to do.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Overall, I was a fan of this one. The next film we're going to talk about is something called The Assessment, directed by Fleur Fortune. And this is about a sci-fi future where couples, in order to have kids, need to get assessed by some government representative who determines whether you are fit, whether you're eligible. It's living in a kind of dystopian future where resources are scarce, and so they need to be very selective about who is able to reproduce. Speaking of things that feel like a real movie, like Eden, this feels like a real movie, which is very impressive for a directorial debut that is clearly this kind of stripped-down sci-fi that was meant for the festival circuit. It stars Elizabeth Olsen and Alicia Vikander. Basically, Elizabeth Olsen is the person who wants to be a mother, and Alicia is the person who is coming to interview her. I thought this movie was really solid, actually. I thought it was super well directed. It's very confident and assured, even when it goes, quote, weird, you know, intentionally. It commits 100%. Like, this movie reminded me of Yorgos Lanthimos movies in the good way of just like, you are having actors who are willing to commit to your zany premise and turn it from the initial kind of awkward laugh that the audience is going to give into, no, we are going to keep going and going and going down this rabbit hole. And you're going to start laughing and end feeling uncomfortable and like just queasy. Yeah, I really liked it. Like I thought this movie just was surprising because I was not expecting a lot out of it. This was kind of just a let's fill in the gaps, and there's some famous actors, so who knows, you know, curious to see what they're going to do. And I thought it was thought-provoking and weird and interesting and just looked fucking great.
Yeah.
The whole way through. If I can criticize it, it's two problems I have that basically come down to one problem, which is this has too many ideas in it. It manifests one way by it wants to be about a relationship, about what does it mean to be a parent, what does it mean to be good together. But whenever characters get close enough to really talking about that, it becomes about this dystopian society instead of why are we alive and why are we here and what are we trying to do. And cramming those two things into one movie feels like it's like a tug of war where it never quite becomes as like profound as I feel like this sci-fi premise could have been. And then the second related one is I think it has too many endings. I think this movie has like about 3 places that would have been perfect to stop, and instead it keeps going and again does the thing where it tells me more and more and more and more when I didn't need it to actually tell me. I could have just enjoyed the mystery of it. But that's the kind of problem that I kind of expect of a first-time film that's at a festival. Overall, I was quite pleasantly surprised by this one, and I had a good time watching it, even though we were plagued with the worst audience members that we've had in any screening.
Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, on the page, and the page being a website where we book tickets, this film is something that like I always try to add to whatever we're seeing at the festival. Just premise alone, you know, people that you're interested in, high concept, talking, right? Like this sort of thing is always something I'm interested in. It doesn't always go perfectly. There are things where I'm like, oh man, that was a wasted premise or anything. And I think that for me, both of your problems are strengths. Oh, nice. Of this film. I love this movie.
Awesome.
This might be my favorite thing I've seen so far at the festival. I added it because I was curious. It was definitely a gamble. And from the moment I started, I was like, holy fucking shit. Like this is not a high concept indie feeling film that creates a premise and then goes and does something else with it. This is all about the premise and all about extrapolating that out into an entire world where this whole matters. And there is a lot of saying and not necessarily showing, but I think for me, it's a strength because it actually shows the amount of work that went into thinking about the world. It's not just like hey, what if there was like a funky test you had to take to be able to figure out if you have a child because of population control? It extrapolates like out into what is the current state of the world, who lives inside versus outside in the old world. And like, there's a lot of stuff that it's doing that for me, I was like, man, I'm vibing the hell out of this. Mm-hmm. And then once like you see people prepare to have this test, which is like, It's basically a tax person coming to your house to do an audit of your life and deciding whether or not you're you are fit to be a parent. And like, that's going to be stressful. People are going to be worrying about it, but like how deep it goes into it and the way it presents it, which we don't have to spoil, is so brilliant and so interesting and so compelling. This film is cast so perfectly, where it's just like every second of this film, minus the 3 people that were sitting in front of us, I was just like, holy shit, I love this movie. I love everything it's doing. I love that it didn't rest on its concept. It was like, no, we're going to make like a really expensive looking sci-fi film in the context of the world we're trying to do. And like, when I say really expensive, like it doesn't look like something that looks as expensive as the creator. But it feels as real to its world as the creator is real to its world. It just, the way it takes whatever its budget was, and it's like, how do we communicate this weird future dystopia thing? It's like, well, a lot of these effects only take place in the sky, which means we have these clean mats to like mess with, but like the effects that it does are so good. And even like, there is a room where one of the characters does his day-to-day job, which is generating these things, and like even that feels like they didn't, it isn't like Star Wars holo projector situation where you hide all the seams by just having it already be janky and low resolution, right? It's just, it feels like this is a high budget, high concept sci-fi film, but also deals with these long monologues from characters and talking about what's going on. And I loved every second of this film, even the multiple endings. And yeah, I was stoked, and I'm so glad that we did in fact see it and that it did work out the way it did.
I'm glad that you loved it, and I do want to clarify, even though I have problems with it, this is also in the running for my favorite thing I've seen so far. Like this year, I have caveats for everything so far. I haven't yet had one where I don't have like some notes. But yeah, like I think when this movie works, it works really, really, really well. And if the over exposition had worked on me the way it worked on you, and this is maybe, I mentioned last night, this is one of those movies where I think I hated the people in front of me so much. It makes it hard to know how I would have felt in a vacuum. It could be that if I were entranced by this movie, when it gets into just the talk about what it's about, I would have already been totally on board. And because I was a little like outside of myself at the time, I was just like, I don't know, you're talking at me, I want you to pull me in a little bit more. But yeah, I think it is a really, really, really well done movie, and it is a surprise of the festival.
All right, the last film of this part that we're going to be talking about is a little film that it's coming out in the next couple months, so it's not like a thing that we technically would have had to wait for too long, but I was super excited for it. This is like probably like my second most excited film that I was for the festival. That's a little film called Heretic, which is written and directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, and these are the people who wrote A Quiet Place and also a little film called 65, which if you've seen it, you might be giggling right now, but whatever, it's cool. But basically Heretic is a story of 2 Mormon missionary girls who are walking around, just trying to preach the good word and get people interested in figuring out more about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or something. And basically they come upon a man who seems to be a vaguely religious person himself, played by Hugh Grant, and he brings them into his house to talk with them. And what proceeds is a sort of psychological / existential religious thriller, all about what it means to believe, and whether belief or disbelief is sort of more right.
Yeah.
I was super excited for this film, again, based on premise alone. Like, I was like, this is like a perfect setup for a fucking film. This is gonna rip. And what I got was a movie that I think fucking rips. Like, this movie's so fucking good. Oh my God, this movie, like from the second it starts, like, whenever we're talking about horror type films, we're always talking about like, how does it build dread and uncomfortableness? And like watching these 2 young girls being put in a situation that even if everything was fine, they would be uncomfortable. You know, they've been trained, you know, like, oh yeah, you can go into a house with a man, but you need to make sure his wife is there or a female roommate is there. Like, there's a lot of things that like scream the normal, like, oh no, danger, right? But the danger here is so differently sinister. And Hugh Grant is playing just this. It's an amazing role for him. And it had to be tough just because there's so much resting on his long monologues and his like seemingly fine. Like there are scenes where he's talking about like they can just leave whenever they want, but he's also forcing them to stay sort of like weird situations. And yeah, I loved every second of it. The performances are amazing. I think the writing is really, really fucking great. And it's just an interesting film that, I'm sure it's going to give a lot of people a lot to think about as they go. There's some interesting flares at the end where they sort of go like, yeah, but also this, but also no, we just gave you like our thesis for like religion and stuff in a way that is probably going to be off-putting to, you know, people. But for me, it worked as a horror film. It worked as like a head-thinky sort of piece. And yeah, I thought it was rad. So.
Yeah, I mean, I also thought this movie was rad. Like I mentioned that 2 movies so far, I think, have delivered on exactly what it promised to the audience, and this is the other one. Like I have notes, but I liked it so much I don't care that much about the notes. Yeah. I mean, the cast is just great here. You know, like Hugh Grant is just wonderful in this role. Like yeah. There's so much, not only is he delivering the dialogue really well, but there's so much that his character does where he's doing the push and pull between being a creep and being like a charmingly befuddled, you know, old guy. There are moments when he will give a bit of dialogue and then like pause and like smirk or laugh or like do a reaction to himself that I'm just like, you are so fucking good.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely feels like that reaction is for us, the audience, because it's like they build in the entire crowd's response to what he's doing so that we don't miss the next part of the monologue that he's about to do.
Yeah. I think Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East are really, really good in the role as like the 2 young missionaries who are there. You know, they're honest. You know, you believe them as kind of the innocents, but then you also like believe when they have to turn a little bit more and take more autonomy in the situation. You know, like I just think they really hold it together. This movie is really funny. This movie had a lot of good laughs for me, not like the performative festival laugh where you're like, oh, ha, 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 you did a silly thing. But like, no, this movie is devious. And like, it's one of those things that almost it has the 8 Mile effect where whenever it does something that I want to criticize of being like a little too on the nose or too preachy, it finds a way to then later be like, and by the way, I know that was a little on the nose or a little preachy. And I'm like, motherfucker, you were just, this is really just a tightly constructed, well done movie. I don't know that it made me think so much as it like dabbled in a bunch of thoughts that I've had before, and it's almost like remixing them in a way that's like, here, we're going to turn your thoughts into a horror movie. But I was totally vibing with it. My the note that isn't really a note because I had a great time with it, I think it could have gone harder and harder as it went along. Like, I feel like it's missing maybe like one big blowout thing that would have put it over the top for me. And a lot of times I was sitting there thinking, man, are they just going to stay in this one place? Like, are they not going to do more with this premise? How much do they think they can just keep talking at me and make it work? And it turns out they know exactly how long. They talk at me for the exact right amount of time, and then the movie's over. Like, it didn't reach heights where I would be like, this is a elevated, incredible experience. But as a like popcorn movie that gives me exactly what the trailer promised, like, holy shit, this is a lot better than, like, when I saw the trailer, I was fearing that this was going to be like a sequel to Escape Room or something like that. Like, this was just going to be we're going to turn into a Saw light type thing, and we're just going to watch as like torture is unfolded on the characters. But this movie is at least as interested in the talky philosophic stuff as it is in the horror. And I think that combo has enough playfulness and lightness that it never feels like too self-serious or self-aggrandizing. Like, it knows what it is. It knows that this is like a late night conversation you have with your friends in your 20s over beers or something like that. Yeah. And it nails it. Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I was skeptical of watching this at a festival, and I'm really glad I did, because it was just it was a total joy.
And like, when this comes out in theaters, I don't know if it's worth us doing like a follow-up full review, but maybe we do just a spoiler conversation for it around that time. But I love what we watched, but the other thing that I love is thinking about everything that's happened up until that moment and everything that'll happen after that moment. And that's
cyclical
where
nature maybe.
Like that's where I'm like, holy shit. Like this itself is already amazing, but in order for this to function, all these things had to happen however many times before that moment, and just extrapolating out from there is this film is terrifying and sinister, and it just makes me go like, holy shit, like this guy is fucked up.
Yeah. I will say, if you just showed me the script, I would be like, there's way too much dialogue. Like there's way too much of this, the heretic or whatever, talking about his beliefs and challenging. But in Hugh Grant's hands, it works so well.
Yeah.
Like, because even the headiness and the like overly serious nature of what he's doing is a part of the story. Like it's a part of the whole thing.
Yeah. And it's like in a normal film, a character of this type, you'd be like, there's no way he's set up this specific room just to give this monologue. That makes no sense. But in this film, you're like, yeah, it makes 100% sense that this guy did exactly this for an exact reason.
Right.
And you're like, man, that is fucking crazy.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So we did it. That's the first 8 films we have seen here at TIFF. So for now, Stephen Miller, people want to find you throughout the week. Where can they do that?
People can find me at Threads at sdavidmiller or sdavidmiller.com.
People can find me at ChristopherInRealLife.com or Christopher IRL on a number of social platforms. You can find the podcast over at thespoilerwarning.com, where you can get a bunch of the back episodes of the show. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do so on Overcast, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts are found. If you want to know when the episodes go live, you can follow us at twitter.com/spoilerwarning, facebook.com/thespoilerwarning, or instagram.com/thespoilerwarning. If you want to get a hold of us directly, you can send an email to fans@thespoilerwarning.com, or you can use the contact form on our site. Yeah, that is it. We have to go shower, eat, and run off to another screening. So take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.